So, our first question for this afternoon, and as I said before, this afternoon is kind of a review and then a taking forward from what we hear together. So this is kind of one of our old chestnuts, fundamental question. What's happening and why? What's happening and why? And in answering that, if you could each, we'll go around first for one specific symptom or one specific expression in the biosphere of what's happening. And then the second time we go around, we'll each share one reason that we understand to be behind this level of disruption. So this is really a kind of just pooling of what we see, pooling of what we know without a lot of interpretation about it. Just, if we were together in another space, I would have a board and we'd write them all down just so we could see it all in one place. So if we can just imagine that. So what's happening and why? For you, what is one specific expression or symptom of what is happening? Who'd like to start?
Species extinction, the sixth great extinction, gathering speed. Since 1970, the world has half as many individual plants and animals as it did. That wasn't very long ago. 78% of freshwater species are gone. 39% of reptiles and amphibians are gone. Something like that, 38% of the mammals are gone. Uncounted numbers of species are gone because we have only the paltriest notion of how rich the world is.
Can you come this way?
And in the face of that, a doubling down of the extreme extraction by the massive and incredibly lucrative and powerful industries that are determined to find ever more damaging and dangerous ways to extract more and more fossil fuel from the mountains and beautiful fjords in the Arctic and just unbelievable devastation.
I was going to say something about the emptiness of our woods. We have so few songbirds now, hardly any, so few animals, but Kathy has already shared this decimation, it's becoming like a stage set almost. It feels to me like it's like this emptiness. But instead I will say the enormous fluctuations now in temperature, in the movement of weather systems due to the destabilization through warming of the Arctic especially. Many of you would know the science better than I, but to now live in regions where the temperature changes 40 degrees from one day to the next often, so that the seasons are not what they once were. They aren't. We're not living in a reliable weather system anymore. It's been profoundly altered by the increase in carbon in the air, as I understand it. And the warming overall.
Yeah, well, there's the signs I sense with my own senses close to home, kind of like what you're saying, Sarah. You know, squishy mud under our boots in February in Vermont, 50 degrees is not right. So people are worrying about the maple trees, they're worrying about the maple syrup. I'm worried about our fruit trees. Are they going to wake up and then get hit by -0 temperatures? And just that feeling of it not being right. Then I guess the point farther away from home I would bring in, last summer I was in Hungary at that same moment when they closed the Budapest train station because there were so many people trying to get from Syria and other points into Europe. So, you know, ongoing, all those families, you know, that could be my family, with a pretty convincing tie to climate change. Not the only thing, but that's how it's going to be, right? It's going to be the interaction of climate change with injustice and dictators and war and yeah, so near and far.
Increasing conflict in places where there is water shortage or less arable land or food shortage that people are looking at as ideological or political, but in fact it has to do with reduced assets, not being able to meet people's needs. So the entire refugee crisis that's going on, both in the old world and in the Americas, is triggered by climate change with various intermediate factors like conflict between Muslims and other religions and so on. And very often the newspapers don't even tell you that there's been a drought or that the crops failed, or they treat it as if the diagnosis is purely political or ideological.
I'll keep it close to where I'm living. On the coast, I'm literally 4 minutes walk to the water. And meanwhile, we've been in this epic drought. And seeing people's individual responses to that has been fascinating. While at the same time, I've noticed that the tides are higher and higher in our estuary. Like when we have a high tide, it's higher than it looks like a lake instead of a marshland. And so I'm starting to think about, you know, the erosion of the coastline as I watch Pacifica fall into the sea this winter. Just a few storms and the cliff started to give way. And meanwhile, I'm seeing fuel prices the lowest I can remember in my adult life. And so people are buying big cars again. And it's just like, didn't you get the memo?
Penguins and polar bears are losing their homes, and many small, defenseless, sentient beings are losing their homes.
There's a few things that I'll just say that you might not know about, and one of the things is the deoxygenation of the oceans, which is being documented now and is the third of the triad of things that has occurred in past extinction events associated with high CO2 levels. So in addition to acidification and warming, now the deoxygenation is starting to occur with some pretty big implications for species changing their distributions, particularly fish species and highly mobile species. We're coming out of a hiatus period. So we're coming out of this period where people, the change in the climate has not been along the trajectory that was predicted because more of the heat was going into the ocean, the deep part of the ocean where it wasn't detected, versus staying in the surface. And Beth, you can correct me on some of this as you want, if you'd like, but it is an El Nino year, which will probably, which will release a lot of that heat back into our system and make climate change more obvious. But at the risk of being the Pollyanna, I also want to say that one of the things I've noticed is increasing optimism that we can do a lot to shift from fossil fuels. That even though technology is not the whole way to get there, that there are things we can do to slow this process down. And I think that there's been some increasing faith in that, and also just the passing of the COP, the Paris Accord, I thought was a fantastic thing that has changed since the last time we met.
Just pass it to me, I'll fix that right up.
I'm the anti-Susie. You're the anti-Joni. That's great.
So a lot of my work is with coastal communities, and I work a lot with communities on all coasts of the U.S., and including Pacific Islands. So, I keep thinking that is far away and I don't know anybody there, but then it keeps coming back into my work. How, the combination of an El Nino year, which in the many of the Pacific Islands means extreme drought, and higher sea level is just making it impossible to get the drinking water they need to grow the crops, the traditional crops. So culture is lost along with food stocks and water and, the habitat. I mean, for them, literally the place to live on. But it's so much more close in. I just returned last week from being at a conference. It was all about coastal issues, and Georgia, Florida, Maine, every state of the union was represented, and every single one of them is like, oh yeah, we're dealing with it. Oh yeah, we're dealing with it. We have to face it, you don't hear that in the news. It's not like a big announcement, we have arrived at adaptation and we're now going to deal with it. And I see a lot of desperate attempts to hold back the seas. And to me, that raises a lot of questions about who's going to pay for that. We don't have that money, not in current ways of governing the coast. Anyway, so I see that. I see the impacts just being a daily thing now, and people becoming used to it. And in my related work around communication, I see so much more despair than I've ever before seen. True, well, I don't know what now. People just feel overwhelmed by what they now experience and getting it. The getting it is really rising. So, don't know how to talk about it, but they're getting it. And then go under the, basically just into hiding, because it's so terrifying and so, we don't have any precedent to having to deal with something this big. Never, as far as I can see.
Now let's go around one more just to see if there's anything that got missed, just in this specific of a symptom, because we're going to then move on and drill down. But any other symptoms that we haven't mentioned?
Building on what Susie said, I also have seen this as that people are turning their attention to adaptation as against so-called mitigation, as against the idea that we've got to stop this, the notion that we can adapt to this. And the question, who's going to pay for it? The answer to that is the future will pay for it, because as we build seawalls, we're using concrete, increasing carbon dioxide, shove those things right off into the future generations.
And then so many other people aren't getting it. So many people aren't getting it. I saw a little article that said that because of the changing wind patterns, a round-trip flight, transcontinental flight now takes 2 minutes longer. And the air is more unstable, and so that will create more emissions from the jumbo jets, and it's just another one of those thousands of feedback loops that is digging us into a deeper hole.
I had just had vivid, well, never mind Camille's beautiful images, but vivid images recently in a variety of ways of the melting polar ice caps. And my brother and sister and nephew went to Antarctica this winter on a luxury cruise, and they didn't mention climate change until the last day. Seriously.
What company?
I'll tell you, the Silver Seas.
Oh yeah, I worked for them.
But we know that we have imminent collapse of major aspects of the ice sheet there, and that we've had the destruction and loss of so much in the Arctic. So it takes my breath away that the unconsciousness in actually being there and not talking about it.
Well, I saw the latest rendition of the graph that gets published every year about the extent of polar ice, and that straight on down trend continues. I guess probably unstoppably at this point. I think a lot of people think that. We're doing a project on resilience to displacement in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Most of the displacement comes from violence, armed gangs that displace people from their villages, but the field work that our collaborators did revealed that on top of all of that misery, there's now increased food insecurity because climate change is showing up as unpredictable weather patterns and crops are failing, which is just going to make that already horrible existence that much harder.
But they still think it's social at base, and that the climate thing is an extra
That's
problem.
how they frame it.
They're still framing it that way, rather than seeing that the ecological effect is affecting their society.
Right, and of course, they're connected.
Right. I'm going to stick to talking about social effects. The rise in racism and ethnocentrism around the world, as people, maybe even only subliminally, are beginning to realize that their resources are limited. I mean, as demonstrated by the current lunacy in American politics.
What Beth was saying about the displacement in Congo is directly related to them wanting to drill for oil, even within the Virunga National Park. So that's one part. I think the racism, honestly, has always been there. It's just being allowed to surface. This phrase I keep hearing about how people are so glad that that Trump can be politically incorrect, like that is basically giving them an open door to let go of whatever lock they had on that part of themselves. But it was always there. And I said this at lunch, when I was at Denali in February, we were told it could be as cold as -40 to -60, and it was +40. It was very warm. They took me around, the rangers there took me to see the drunken trees, which is caused when the permafrost is melting and the trees start to lilt. And then they took me to this area and showed me where the willow, which is a small plant, a bush size, is creeping up the slopes because it has longer growing period, and how this is endangering the ram, the sheep, bighorn sheep, because they need wide open, clear spaces. So even within, our most northern one of the most northern national parks, these effects are being every day part of the reality.
Desperation, denial, and an inability to metabolize the truth.
That's all I'm gonna follow. Since no one's brought it up, I would like to ask if Zika means anything to you. Because, it embodies so many of the things that you were talking about, the discrimination, the indirect effects of climate change, which we rarely talk about. We still talk about the very visible things, the melting ice, the birds leaving, but there's so many other subtle impacts, and I think those are going to be the ones that really, in addition to wars and racism and all these other things that affect human communities, I think some of these diseases are incredibly frightening to me and symbolic.
Two things to add, one good, one bad. It's just, to me, a remarkable challenge to deal with the particular system we have and the election cycles involved in it, and to get anything long-term done in a system that is designed to, eradicate all long-term thinking on principle. And the other thing that is, I think, a rather long-term shift and profound shift is that I'm part of no less than 5 separate conversations, all happening in separate corners, that are all about how to improve the link between science and policy.
Improve.
The link between science and policy. In various ways, various corners, various parties involved, but there is some desperate recognition that we're not linking effectively what we do know with what we do, how we make decisions. And I think there's beginning to be a shift that it's, in recognition, it's not just a problem with scientists, or lack of information, or what we talked about last night, but that there may be something about the way we make decisions, and we might have to think that through too. Like maybe wiser decisions or something? I don't know. Just thinking. Ethical ones?
Why don't we switch now to the next, unless you had something else, Kathy, did you have something else you wanted to add?
We could go on this way for quite a long
I want to say
time.
one more thing about public health, because it's very much to your point. So my friends in global health, I have dear friends in global health, say that Ebola, Zika, malaria, these diseases that clearly are changing and will continue to change as a consequence of global warming. We have so underfunded and strangled the public health infrastructure in this country and in this world that there is no surveillance, there is no adequate surveillance. The reason Ebola snuck up on us is we're not doing surveillance. Zika we could have known about long before we did. And it's true of all of these things. The World Health Organization is paralyzed. There's no leadership there. And it's just part of the same, you said systems designed to eradicate all long-term thinking, and it's happening in public health. It has been happening for years, and it's a systematic pulling away of support for this.
So in this next round, based on everything we've heard, but altered a little bit, let's offer just I mean, this is very much reducing the complexities, but if each of us would just say one reason in this world that this is happening. Just one way you would, if somebody asks you, if Tala says to you, Mom, why is this happening? What is your answer to her? And we may have many similar responses. So when you've heard what you would say to your child already, think of the other next thing that you would say. Why is this happening? We know there's some very simple reasons, there's some very complex reasons. Let's just gather those from our different perspectives, and maybe just in a couple of sentences. Would you like to start?
Unless you want to.
No, I just was holding it. We can put it there. Would you be willing to start?
I'd be willing to start.
Wonderful, thank you.
Why do I think this is happening? Well, I think one of the main things is it's not like it just started happening, right? This has been happening for 500 years or 1,000 years, whenever you want to. I would maybe start with colonialism and conquest and empire and a rise of a disconnected way of thinking that has people outside of nature and not embedded in a planet, and not responsible to each other or to future generations. So we have a lot of fancy systems language, and I could draw you 15 feedback loops for the broken, if only we measured this and use that to inform this decision. But that's what it comes down to, I think, is disconnection.
I think we have gotten ourselves into a self-reinforcing process of wanting more. It's like an addiction. Except people feel it's their right. I think that's one reason there's such an atmosphere of resentment at the moment. Let's not help anybody else. It's my right to have more, to earn more, to spend more, to own more. And I think it's been happening for a very long time. The notion that we might not only share the planet with people from different nationalities and races, but share it with other species, just isn't there. The model, a model of living in balance, a model of stability, a model of cooperation is missing. When people's assumption is that there's always going to be more, there's always going to be improvement, and that competition is what makes the world go round. And therefore it's good. I mean, it's good to get 2-year-olds learning to compete with each other. And how do you measure success in competition? By consumption.
There's this great Sherman Alexie quote. Someone asked him if he believed in God, and he said, "I believe in stories. I believe in stories." And I think that this is happening because there's such an entrenched support of a story. How long ago that story began or why is another question, but even though that story doesn't serve us any longer, we refuse to allow ourselves to admit that it no longer serves us and it has no correctness. So it's we're on railroad tracks that we refuse to build tracks to turn it away from the cliff. And if we could show people another story, give them another story that they say, oh yeah, that's a good story, and allow them a way to exit away from this other story, we might have a chance. But until then, I don't see how it will shift. That's why we're here.
Ignorance, egotism, greed, and aggression. I think there's a hole in the human heart, and no amount of stuff or exotic places or money will ever fill it. And it's unchecked.
So I think it's very similar to what many of you have said already. It's just become a severe imbalance between two things that our society needs, as competition and altruism. And back to what you said, Willa, there's definitely even just very recent evidence that narcissism is on the rise.
Sorry?
Narcissistic personality or narcissistic tendencies is increasing, as evidenced in just the selfie, right? There's many examples where you can see that, and I think it's just our culture has allowed this imbalance between we prize competition way more than altruism, and I think it's just become an imbalance. They're both still there, they're just imbalanced.
It's hard to add to this. So maybe what I want to do is reframe, because I sort of, yes. But the way I've been thinking about it recently, in large part through the conversations I've been in with my partner, who is looking at the place we're in through a transformative lens of initiation, cultural maturity, and those sorts of things. It feels to me we have been children and early adolescents for a very long time, and we exhibit all the traits of an ego-driven adolescent, and that we are about to go through an initiatory rite of passage, which is really what she writes about, and what I very much agree with. And as in all rites of passage, the outcome is not assured. But so what I would say is that, as with every initiand, we create our own crisis, which we then get to suffer through in the ordeal of the threshold of that rite of passage. So in some ways, I feel like we have, just been regular adolescents, patho-adolescents at certain times, and you've been all speaking to that. But now at the threshold of having to deal with the consequences of that, to be seen what the outcome is.
I also think that everything you've said is very perceptive and is sadly, tragically true. Lewis Mumford calls it the terrible bribe. He says we're all complicit in the terrible bribe, that we can have anything we want, on demand, endless, without a limit, all this imported food, imported everything, beautiful food and leather goods, anything you want, travel to the Alps, on the condition that we never ask the cost the cost to the past, the cost to the people who are suffering as a result of our accepting this bribe, and the cost to the future, as long as we never look back and as long as we never look forward. If we look forward or back, it's over. It can't be continued, and the whole structure falls apart. But I would say something more, and I would say that all the things that we've been talking about, I think so perceptively, are in some ways the fertile soil or the backdrop or the stage on which the big corporate interests are playing out the end of the world. And that this isn't accidental, that these characteristics we are all describing are permitting these big corporations to make money that is unimaginably huge by the business plan, which is to wreck the world. And because we've bought into it, we're not standing up to stop them, but they create demand with their advertisements. They pin us in place by trying to kill off alternatives to fossil fuels. They bribe the politicians so that they will reduce the regulation of the fossil fuel industry. The list goes on, and I don't need to have to, I just don't need to go there. But I think we should be very clear that what we're seeing is the playing out of a business plan.
Yeah, that's where I was going. I was going with Naomi Klein to capitalism and to the logic of capitalism taken to its extreme. And the other piece of that is militarism. It's Eisenhower. It's the military-industrial complex, which is also a business plan.
Yeah.
Right? If you make everyone terrified of the terrorists, and you buy more and more weapons, and you build more and more weapons, and you create more and more bizarre weapons, and your little 7-year-old grandson has every kind of... I was with him in the backyard yesterday, 2 days ago, whenever, in his backyard, and he has this little Nerf gun, and he's starting to shoot the bullets. And he said, Nana, I might take this to school and hide it in my desk. I said, Sean, you can't do that. He said, yeah, I could. They're not real bullets. I said, Sean, Sean, by the way, is brown. He's a little brown boy. His father is very dark-skinned Indian. I said, Sean, they shoot little boys who have guns that are play guns. Police have no... He looked at me in disbelief. Right, so that too. I mean, there is something evil in the way capitalism has, and Marx saw it. He saw it in a different way. He didn't see this. But so we feel like we're victims of something, this craving that is just completely impossible to quell. And we are, because it's advertised. It's the Super Bowl. This world we live in. So it's that. And then, but the simplest question, the simplest picture that first came to my mind when you said, and you said to Camille that she should think about what she would tell her daughter. And so immediately you brought my grandson into it, and I wanted to punch you because I don't want to have to tell him, And of course, what you would tell them is this simple teaching. It's a Native American teaching, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's used. People quote it all the time about the chief who says the little boy that there are two wolves warring inside of you, and one of them is hungry and vicious and dangerous, and the other one is loving and caring and kind. And the little boy says, well, which one is going to win? And he says, it depends on the one you feed. We've been feeding the wrong wolf. We've been feeding the wrong wolf for all these years since you located the beginning of this. And somehow we've lost sight of the fact that there is another wolf, that there was another way, and that's what the Buddhists are trying to invite us to see.
Oh, boy. So following on that, that other voice, that other wolf, the native cultures around the world, most of them understood that. I think they lived, I don't want to generalize, I don't want to romanticize, but it's also just to say, where did the listening go? Where did the being in the world from a position of listening? because you can tell from the culture of so many earlier peoples that they were in reciprocity. They were listening to where they were, what the possibilities were, what the limits were. They were in a dance, a sacred kind of a dance, which acknowledged our interdependent nature and reality. And how we became so disconnected, how we stopped listening to that other voice as a people. I'm not sure we didn't all. We're sitting here together. We're asking these questions. We didn't stop listening. A lot of us didn't stop listening. But culturally, we got caught in this other path. And it's as if there's this ignorance that Willa speaks of, this profound ignorance as to our own self-benefit or our own needs, our own what it is that will sustain us. It's as if there's a word I'm forgetting here, but anyway, that we need to be listening in order to flourish. We need to be smaller in order. These people who have all of this, they're not benefiting. They're not joyous. These people going to Switzerland to whatever. That is, so how did we stop listening?
Can I just put one more piece of the puzzle? So there was a literature, and I think it's disappeared, I don't know if it has or it hasn't, that talked about the degradation of the cultural environment. And one of the people who was writing in this vein wrote this powerful piece in which he said, from time immemorial, children have been learning about what is important in the world through the stories that adults tell them. But in these times, the stories our children are hearing are coming from people who want to sell them a product. And that's where we stopped hearing, I think, about the good side. So all the stories are trying to enculturate these kids into a consumerist society where they'll just continue to spend money.
And also, our listening is in our bodies. We are those who listen. We came in as listeners, right? And so there's some way that happens, and then we just are separated from the vulnerability of being a listening agent in a living system. Because we come with this ability to know what is possible, needed. I keep thinking, would I, even now as whatever I am from being part of this culture, would I ever agree to run some kind of a business that emitted black smoke into the air? I don't think I would. I would say, physically, I would say, no. This smells bad, tastes bad. It's got to be bad for the common good. You would just know it in your body. Yeah.
Just go back, Rod.
And yet, we drive our cars,
Yeah.
which smell bad and aren't good for the commons and aren't good for people. So I think we're going to have to add to the list the inability to confront our own compromises.
Yeah.
And that's the scariest part, because we are so, I was going to say comfortable, but that's probably the wrong word. Self-satisfied might be the better word. Okay,
Well, I guess what the word that struck me in what you just said, Sarah, was about knowing it in our body, and how I sometimes am not sure that we always know what the right thing is. And it has to do with what you both earlier talked about, the complexity of the systems we're part of and the gray that we see. I want to tell you very briefly a story that's been haunting me in recent weeks. So I have a little nephew, he just turned 4, and he came to visit a few months ago. And he is at this age where he's completely into dragons. Every dragon and dinosaur and whatever that ever lived on the planet, he is just totally enthused by. And so I gave him a toy that had to do with dinosaurs. And so he got very interested in it, and he is this very bright little kid. And so he then interviewed his father about everything that he could possibly get out of him about dinosaurs. And in that context, he learned that dinosaurs went extinct, because it's the obvious question, where are they, right? If they once lived, where are they now? Well, they went extinct. And ever since then, he's been maybe related to a bunch of other things, but telling his mother he doesn't want to go extinct. And he keeps asking her, when will I go extinct? And when will I die? And why is that happening? And, and so here, I did what I did, give him this present out of complete love for, something that he's completely fascinated by, and brought into his life, 4-year-old life, a concept that is beyond comprehension, and yet he's grappling with it, and he is frightened by it, and I kind of don't have any answer now. I just said to her mother, my half-sister, don't tell him about global warming. I mean, just, wait till he's totally fallen in love with the planet and, maybe then break it to him. But we don't know always how to handle these situations. They get so tricky, and, I want to tell him the truth, and then I don't really, and so, I don't know. It's not that easy. No. At least, I don't know. If you know how to deal with 4-year-olds, come to me later. An extinction.
So I just want to ask a question, or bring up a topic, because we do talk about business and capitalism and how it's gone awry, and is a very big reason why we're in the position we're in. But there's also this tendency to look to business as the solution. And so I struggle with whether we stick to this basic principle of the system that we're in, capitalist society, using competition to say, compete with the Chinese to develop solar energy or some of these other energies, or anything that has to do with business that can contribute to the solution, and whether we should call them out for their practices and the way they practice. So that's just an internal struggle I have with the sort of the business side of the problem.
Not right now.
Yes, we are complicit. And yes, we have forgotten who we are. And I think Mary would have some things to say about that. Remembering who we are, what our origins, like
You
that.
said somebody would have something to say.
Mary Ellen.
Oh.
It's almost like we got hit with a bad case of amnesia and started behaving really badly. But I think, historically you can trace the beginnings of this to agriculture, and then having to figure out a system of how do we pass the land on, and then things become ownership and property, including women. And in that moment, women are sort of letting go of their right as a partner. They become property. And now we're emerging from that. Women are rising again and standing in their power. And so that voice of life-giving and nurture, cooperation versus competition, has a voice again. And so That's it.
Well, did you?
I thought of something, but go ahead, Mary Catherine.
Well, just
May risk
I thought
losing.
of something. I thought of something that was different. I mean, I was just, nodding, yes, yes, yes. But also fear. And fear, I was talking to a psychologist recently who described human beings as, let's see, what did he call us? That we are constant risk assessors, like that our physiology, every time we walk into a new environment, he said you can measure this, that our whole physiology, our eyes look for threats, and our bodies are sensing if the place is safe, that we're risk assessors as mammals, not just as animal beings. And I was thinking about that in its relationship to this whole issue, and wondering, perhaps some of what we see is a giant risk assessment, or like a giant search for safety gone awry. I mean, that the state of the planet is largely that we're all seeking safety, comfort, and ease, and we've just been allowed, by the basis of our capabilities as human beings, to take that to an extreme, and to the extreme that we're no longer safe, we're no longer going to be comfortable, and we're no longer going to be at ease. But lately, when I've been thinking about that, it's a cause for compassion. When you think about each of us are doing that all the time, then some of the dysfunctionality becomes somewhat understandable. But then where do you go from there? How do you interact with creatures who are afraid, and maybe speak to that part of them to help them understand that it's much safer to be sustainable. It's a happier world in the way that Beth described. So maybe there's some way to leverage that animal being in us.
It occurred to me fairly recently that the myth of the Tower of Babel is attempting to explain the condition we are in. Myths are made up to explain things. And in the story, all human beings are one language and one family, and they decide to build a tower up to God. And God doesn't like that. And so he confounds the languages. He makes it impossible for people to collaborate in this presumptuous task. That they can't get the bricks and the mortar to the right place at the right time, and they wander off in all different directions. And we've been at war with each other ever since. And I do think that one of the odd things about human beings is our capacity to treat other human beings as belonging to a different species. And in a sense, it's the willingness to do that that undermines our sense of being part of a larger whole, in which we think about the future and other people's children and the health of the planet. We set up these oppositions as ways of affirming our own identities, our own egos. And in that sense, war with other nations and exploitation of the environment are the same problem. They're the same failure to say, we're in this together. It's something we're not good at saying. we say we're in this against each other again and again.
Um, Yeah, I guess I'm just sitting with this, it's this really long story that we're telling of disconnection. And so here we are in the last 10 years, maybe, that matter out of a 500, 1,000 year story. And I'm just noticing how much in me is the instinct to like solve it, turn it around, like as though we're going to all together understand what happened and choose a different course and get off of those railroad tracks that Camille was talking about. And that's how I think almost all the time, that's the job that we have to do. And that's what all these global processes and COPs and treaties and education is all about. But I don't know. I mean, this is also just evolution of an animal. And I don't know if it changes in that kind of planned sort of way. And so maybe one of the most useful things to do with these 10 years that we're talking about is understand what went wrong and support the pockets, because there are all these pockets of resistance, right? It's not as though indigenous people left the face of the earth. And, what I noticed was who in Paris was talking about the earth as a sentient being with its own rights and future generations with their own rights were the indigenous people, who are quite organized and quite powerful in that space. And there are all of us and our experiments, and the experiments our experiments touch. And I don't know. Maybe there's just, I'm stretching for the words, but maybe it feels so hard because we're trying to imagine this very coordinated, organized, orchestrated thing, and it's probably not going to be that. And one of our first circles, I think it was Kathleen, talked about refugia. The little pockets of things that survive. And something about initial conditions. So there were some really bad initial conditions centuries ago. And it's really hard to get out of the grooves those have dug. What are the initial conditions that we should be trying to seed? That's the question that this leads me to.
I'm just going to say one more thing, and then we'll close and do our shift. I was, from some combination of what you've been saying, Beth, and Susie's image of us as adolescents, image of us as an adolescent, culture, but all, yes, culture. There's, in Kim Stanley Robinson's Shaman, this initiation process that the hero, the young man, goes through, and how we don't know how it comes out, but it is full of the uncertainty and the reality of being in a process of evolution on a planet, this planet, at a very different stage. I don't know if it was 20,000 years ago.
What's the time of the Lascaux caves, the cave paintings? That was the time.
Oh, 40,000 or something. Anyway, very long ago. And there is something about that level of not knowing and listening and being embodied and working with fear was so much a part of what he has to do in order to move through that initiation rite. And it feels to me like if we see ourselves at that moment and accept some of the evolutionary process that this is, that there's some places there for us to find our contributions. Did you want to say one more thing?
I just want to connect the two. I mean, so I don't think they're separate. You know, there are people who are saying that those who have gone through an initiation and have experience with the trials and tribulation, if you will, of an ordeal, are most likely to end up in the refugia. You know, because I mean, and that'll be the cultural seed that goes on. I mean, it's a very hopeful image, if you will, and who knows whether, you know, that will be the case. But there's something about being tested in that way, that if you have gone through that, you know, in your own life or in this kind of a right, you're in a different way equipped than if you're approaching it with fear, ignorance, you know, and the litany that you offered. So I think it just puts maybe an interesting nest egg into the little pockets that may make it.
Thank you. Thank you.